Headcount Experts, episode 5. We're officially past the halfway point. This one's all about the best practices everyone can do when doing headcount planning. Doesn't matter if you're using Meander, the services of Chris Mannion, or Headcount 365, the headcount planning software that I've built. These are 5 things you could do no matter what your stage or software or capabilities are as a business. These are the best practices that Chris and I have built across our careers, doing it at Wayfair, at Uber. And so that's what you're in for this episode. And as a special guest, we have Mr. Miller, Jim Miller, the VP of People and Talent from Ashby, joining us to give us his perspective on headcount planning and how he's doing it today. So very excited for that. Our first guest on the Headcount Experts podcast, but episode 5. What a great way to cross the halfway point.
Amazing. I feel like we've talked about so many things so far, and I'm just really excited to learn from Jim about what he's doing, what he's seen in practice, what's changed maybe over the last few months, and how he's thinking about 2026. So it's an exciting day.
Agreed. A wealth of knowledge. We're very happy that he's joining, and you'll see him later on in the episode. But let's open strong. Here are the 5 things I think anyone can do in a headcount planning process, regardless of what you're doing. 1, make sure your data's clean. Whether that's last year's or next year's, make sure your data's clean. We'll get into what that means. Number 2, have an approval process to change it so that you can have a record of how these changes happen. 3, once you have all your demand in place, map your recruiting capacity against demand. Make a visual representation of that relationship so that you can highlight areas where either there are gaps or you have more capacity and can take on other projects. Number 4, track your variance. If a plan was just the plan, you and I probably would be out of a job. Plans change, businesses evolve, sales happen, people quit. So track all the variance and why the variance is happening. And then last, I think the thing that you and I have really excelled at to get to where we are now is have an ROI mindset. So when you're going to ask for something or recommend something, you don't do it through the phrase I. You say you will, as a business, have more revenue or production if we hire another recruiter. You, as a business, will have more predictable hiring if we do this headcount planning process. So frame it in somebody else's in lens. But those are my 5. I don't know does that resonate? Are you feeling the same way? Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's been kind of one of the themes throughout the discussions we've had so far is, a couple of things that, I'd kind of drill down on. One is the data. Just make sure the data's accurate. If you're making decisions on bad data, then the decisions are going to be wrong. And halfway through next year, you're going to ask yourself, why did things not work out the way we planned? And data is probably one of the key drivers for that. And even when you have your data locked in, the variance is going to be one of the other key drivers. So even if your data is accurate, if you've not predicted what's going to happen next year, you're probably going to have some surprises. And then the third thing, so cut it down from 5 to 3. Third thing I would say is talking the language that the business understands, the ROI, the cash, the revenue. Like, what does this actually mean? And what is the impact if we don't do this thing? I think if you can nail those 3 things, I think 2026 headcount planning is not going to be a breeze, but it's going to be much more successful than in previous years because you're constantly learning from different iterations that you've had in the past. So really like that 5-point framework. I'd even kind of simplify it even further, but I think that's the right way to go and something to take away for everyone on the call.
Yeah, I think people will listen to these, take away what they will. I harp on, so the reason why I started down the path of headcount was I got good at data cleanliness, which really for me meant adding a unique ID, a number that said, this is the line item of demand that you're asking me to do. It's kind of title agnostic. I think a big mistake early headcount planners make is they do things on title or they do things on department. But if people trade, combine, split these requisitions into more than one, you need a initial reference point. You need something that you can latch onto and say, you wanted a manager of recruiting, but now you have 2 recruiting coordinators. And so how do you tell finance? Like, how do you reference that? And how do you especially in the bigger companies where you have a bunch of different titles? So the unique ID is huge for me in terms of like, how do I figure that out? Now, obviously with software, we've automated it, but I've always tracked that kind of as a column so that I can look at how a requisition or a plan has changed over time. So the unique ID is kind of big for me, and I'll tell you why in practice. But how have you done that? Have you done unique IDs, or did you do unique IDs at Wayfair? How have you done it, and why has it been beneficial?
So unique ID is notoriously hard to track across different silos. So you think you have your ATS, you have your HRIS, you probably have some other tools that you're using. Maybe you have a CRM, maybe you have kind of an internal engagement tool. And each of these are kind of sitting in its own data silo. Without that unique ID, it's kind of quite hard to kind of read across and actually get useful insights from the data that you have. So in the past, what we've done is actually spent a lot of time cleaning the data and trying to match kind of row by row. I think one of the easiest approaches that you can take is to have something that is going to be consistent across those. So maybe a personal email address. We all know those change, but if you actually want to look at the whole employee lifecycle from pre-hire, from when they first applied in the ATS or were added to the ATS, or through a LinkedIn outbound sourcing campaign, all the way through to when they left the organization and what they did after they left, you're actually going to need that kind of like unique ID going all the way through. So I'd say, email address is probably the simplest kind of easy approach if you can attach it to every point in the chain. But realistically, unless you've got some software that's going to help you to do that at scale, there's a lot of data you're going to miss. And so while you can get, glean some insights from that, it's actually going to be really hard to drive big decisions because you're not going to have all of the information that you really need. And that was a big challenge that we always faced. And so we would generally kind of look at these kind of data cohorts. So we look at our ATS and look at, from kind of engagement through to offer. And then we'd actually look at the kind of internal employee data separately. And then we look at maybe post exit data separately as well. And so you're kind of not really telling the full story. You're telling like three different stories. But that was the kind of limitations that we had at the time. Improved over time as we got better at actually matching the data. But that was a huge effort from a very big team and a lot of hard work. I don't know if you saw the same thing at Uber or with any of the customers that you're working with right now.
No, I think the biggest thing I'll probably say is going to be consistent across some listeners is you're going to have a role that has multiple postings, but it's the same role. So I want to hire something in two locations. And so if you put two jobs in your ATS because they're in different locations, you want to run two pipelines, but you don't have a unifying ID, you might overhire, you might double hire. And it becomes very difficult to track kind of like what happens. And people do that for a number of reasons, maybe track pipeline by location or something like that. But, having a unique ID lets you run a process that you want to run, but unify it to this, kind of individualized history that lets you, again, contribute to the headcount planning process for future years. So if you always have one ID, you can always track how that ID has changed. And yeah, you've heard me say it before, the plan change rate. But, those changes, the second thing is the approval process, right? So like getting a third party, non-invested partner to just sign off on a change. Most folks will do like my manager, finance, my executive, but there's a lot of complexity in approvals that we've discovered as we've rolled out Headcount 365. Different people have different things, but that approval process is kind of good air cover for a recruiting leader to say like, oh, the business has approved this change or this variance from the original headcount plan year. So having an approval system, I've seen people do it many ways, right? This has been a focal point of Headcount 365, a way bigger product than I thought it would ever be. But I've seen people use Jira and Jira ticketing. I've seen people use Monday, Google Forms, email, Slack. There's all these different ways to do it. I built Headcount 365 for a reason, but so long as you have a process to have a log of someone else approving a change, you're not going to run into common problems like, managers empire building, like, oh, I gave you all ICs, but now you wanted to hire all directors. So approvals are, I think, the second biggest thing that you could do in your headcount planning process that will make a more crisp, more accurate headcount plan for the next year.
Yeah, I think that's often an overlooked area. What I've seen in practice is that these kind of internal tools are spun up, and they're helpful in that they add a little bit of process. But I think what's not always kind of focused on is how does that process actually translate to velocity of decision making, but also quality of decision making as well. Like, is the end decision maker making the best decision based on all the information they have, or they just have another notification in their inbox and then just clicking yes and not actually understanding what that means for the kind of big picture. And so I think there's a huge opportunity area there where actually having a robust requisition approval system or headcount approval system where you are able to kind of compare what this approval will do to the big picture. If you're a senior leader and you're not going to know every single kind of line item, is going to be really important. I've sat in meetings with CEOs of large organizations where they're manually looking line by line at every requisition going through because they got to a point where too many requisitions were approved, the company was overhiring. And so then you had to kind of dial everything back, slow everything down, and a whole bunch of friction to the process, which then becomes very frustrating for all the senior leaders who are trying to build their teams, not necessarily empire building, to actually deliver on revenue goals. And so
Yeah,
it becomes a very manual process if you don't have the system in place to do it.
yeah, we saw that happen. I don't know if I can name the companies on. I don't want to. They may be customers in the future, but I saw it during the pandemic, like a lot of overhiring and then a lot of offer rescinded, and that was an issue. But I would say for approvals, right? If you are doing headcount planning or you're supplying data to the headcount planning process, I always have a column in my headcount spreadsheet, or now in Headcount 365, we have a whole tool for it where I would track the reason for the change, right? Why did this change happen? And it could be as simple as the business planning changed, the hiring manager changed, the recruiting team couldn't do it. There's like very simple categories that will help inform your future headcount planning process of, these approvals and what happened with the approvals. But you can get super advanced, like, did the amount of time it took to get the approval through the process, did that get in the way of actually hiring this requisition on time? Like, there's very advanced metrics you could do, but having the approval system, I think any company that's kind of trying to mature their headcount process, installing an approval system is something that will help you get there much faster, because it's a secondary audit. It's a pre-variance checkpoint, so that you don't have as much you don't have as much variance. You have control of your hiring managers. You track your reasons for change, and you can have a more predictable plan change rate.
I actually think even going back to the first point of actually having that unique ID to look at a kind of consistent across all your different data silos. If you have that in your approval process as well, you can then start to link backfills or kind of net new growth in organizations. And you can actually start to tie things together and look at kind of flow of talent through the organization. And actually tie that back to some of the metrics that are very important for planning for the future, like, time to hire, cost, quality of hire, if we're going to go down that rabbit hole. But, you can really start to kind of get some meaningful insights and see, we talked about the employee life cycle. How long did it take to backfill someone? And that's going to be really important if you're planning ahead, because if it takes a month to get an approval for a backfill role, then 3 months to hire that person, and then 3 months to ramp them, then all of a sudden you've got this kind of 7-month window where if someone leaves and they give 2 weeks notice, you're going to be out of pocket for such a long period of time, that you actually really need to start thinking about how do you plan for those kind of eventualities and actually bake that into the 2026 plan. Not assume that that's not going to happen, but look at what happened in 2025 and really kind of use the data that you have, assuming that you can actually join everything together with that unique ID.
Great point, because what if you sell a new deal too, right? And that deal starts in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. Like, there's a certain amount of, when you're doing a headcount planning process, that kind of time window that Chris mentioned, equally as important to net new as it is backfills, although they're all related. And then to expand on your other point, that unique ID, good luck tracking without a system merges and splits, right? So like, I have 2 roles I want to combine into one. I have 1 role I want to split in 2. I have an opportunistic hire that I want to actually replace a role, but we're at the offer stage in the ATS. So there's a lot of benefits to doing that individual ID tracking, and through an approval process, it will help you kind of track each one of those IDs without someone going rogue and then you having to reconcile it across all the systems later. So, good point. I think once you have your IDs and once you have an approval process to change, you generally have a plan. And for everyone listening to this podcast who's at a company that's more than 1 year old, you have previous data. And so the next big thing I tell people to do for their headcount planning process is map capacity versus demand. So what did the business ask of you last year? And then how did the recruiting team perform against it? This was tremendously informative for the headcount planning process, and it allows managers to adjust the volume, adjust the timing, and it brings that executive team into your conversation. We'll get into it as topic number 5, ROI based thinking, but it brings that executive team into the thought process of, oh, if we invest in the recruiting team, we get better results. So capacity demand is another big one for me.
Yeah, I think even kind of building on that, going kind of a level deeper in looking at capacity versus demand, you can actually go back and look at what was the capacity that you expected, and kind of look at that against different line items. So it could be, by team, by function, by product line, by P&L, like whatever is important to measure as a business. What did you expect it to be in 2025? And so recording that kind of forecast that you made versus what was it actually, and then what was the delta there? Like what was the kind of actual divided by forecast? And then the next level is if you take the average of all of those, you can actually use that as a baseline for like how far off the forecast are you likely to be given how accurate your forecasts were in the past. So you're kind of forecasting a forecast, but it's ripped directly from operations theory, directly from what sales and operations planning teams do, if they have the right data and they have the right kind of capabilities. But this is something that we do for our clients, is like not just what do you expect it to be and we'll staff to that demand, but how wrong were you in the past? And then let's assume that you're this wrong again in the future. Then you can dynamically adjust, but having that ability to forecast based on your historic error rate is a huge win when you're kind of planning for success in the future.
One of the things I like to do with Headcount 365 is pitch to varying degrees of success how including this capacity and demand information is good for performance management, whether it's a recruiter who overperforms against their capacity or a hiring manager who's asking more of the team that they have without the proper process. The idea that the headcount metrics can improve your performance management, probably a topic for another episode, but you can only do that if you start tracking. And it could be very, as simple as a monthly hire amount and a monthly start amount. And you start very basic, you can add your advanced metrics from within. But that is yet another kind of data point that is subject to variance tracking, which is what you're just talking about, right? Not only variance of production, but variance against capacity. These are two of many variance metrics that are important to the future headcount planning process. Of course, my favorite being the plan change rate, which is just that raw variance of what did we think we were going to do versus what actually was requested in a given year. But by tracking this variance, it's I call it anti-hubris. You get to bring people down from this, like, the plan is set. It is correct. We know what we're talking about. We have great models. And if you have year over year historical variance tracking for all of your entire headcount plan, you can kind of like build a little buffer in to what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like what surprises did you have last year, and were you able to predict those surprises? And if you weren't able to predict them, that you should expect to have other surprises you can't predict this year. It's the kind of Johari's window of known knowns, known unknowns. And known unknowns is the one that you should be most scared about. But we won't go into that on the call. But yeah, I think there's kind of a lot to that. And it goes beyond just kind of data analysis and kind of reporting. It actually goes into more like human psychology and how do you actually lean into what we know about how we make decisions in order to make better decisions in the future and just improve iteratively over time.
I like the way you put the surprises. There's good surprises, there's bad surprises. Good surprises, I promoted somebody, I need to backfill them. We did a big sales deal, we need a bunch more headcount. There are good surprises. I don't think everything is so negative of like we didn't meet demand or the changes happen. It could be the good stuff too. And I think surprise management is something that is very important to the headcount planning process. We have about 5 minutes left before Jim joins, which is probably going to be a good transition. We'll see if we could time it perfectly. It's not like he's in a waiting room waiting to join, but the last thing's ROI mindset, right? So the consistent thing I've seen, I tried to do it when I was a leader, but folks like Jim Miller and some of the other leaders that we've had on the Unicorn podcast or that I've worked with personally, they understand the executive language and they speak it. And that taking the, 4 things that we've talked about is, what is the unique IDs? Who approved that these could happen? How has it changed? And what is the performance of my team versus your team? Framing that into why it's valuable for you, tremendously important in navigating this conversation. How did you do it? when you were at Wayfair, when you're building the case from your team's perspective, how did you get all this information in front of the people that could make the decisions, and how'd you get them to make the decision in your favor?
Yeah, I think I was quite fortunate because one of the teams that I eventually inherited was our recruiting analytics team. They'd already been doing some amazing work, and so actually pivoting that team to be more kind of operationally focused helped us to actually get some kind of like tangible data points from the recruiting process that then fed directly into that forecasting capability. And so running recruiting analytics and a recruiting team, I was able to kind of join the two pieces together and then look ahead and say, okay, given what you've asked for in this coming year, and given what you've seen in the past, and given your historic hiring performance by hiring manager, by team, this is what's realistic. This is what's not realistic. And so these are the recommendations that I would make based on this team over here who's implemented these kind of approaches and has seen their performance improve. So I think pivoting the data points that you have available to you, and using that kind of comparison between kind of a team that is asking for something. To give you a tangible example, I had a product team that was really looking to grow. And the way that they had decided they were going to do that was they were going to post a lot of roles. Each role is going to be very bespoke, and so they were going to hire a whole bunch of people, and that's how they were going to grow their team in the coming year. What eventually happened is they had 70 roles posted on the website, and those 70 roles were all important and all needed to be filled, but a candidate would kind of jump on there and wouldn't really know kind of which one to select. And so we looked at what had worked for other teams, and I think Jim talking about programmatic hiring and his focus on inbound, I think is going to be a really good example maybe to compare against this. But by actually filtering those 70 into 5 different evergreen pipelines, we were able to kind of funnel the right people to the right roles quickly. But they weren't just going to take my recommendation from that based on my intuition. I had to show the hard data. I had to show, okay, if we look at this team who've implemented this kind of approach, this is how that improved their time to hire and their quality of hire. So they were not necessarily, we were able to better match candidates to the roles that were going to be the best fit for them, rather than relying on them picking themselves and then having to disposition them from the pipeline. So we had this kind of use case of, this is what good looks like. This is what, if a team implements this approach, they can reduce time to hire, they improve the overall quality based on first year retention rate, and therefore the team grows at a sustainable rate and hit their goals. Your team in 2025 did not implement this. You adapted this process and you didn't hit your goals, and also your attrition rate was twice what this comparison team was. So this is why I recommend that you implement these, and this is going to be best for your organization. I would love a whiteboard to actually walk through this, but quick monologue of how that actually worked out in practice. I think there's a lot that can be gained by just doing that kind of comparison. We know if as a former leader in the business and working with many other business leaders, pairing kind of one person to another is probably one of the best psychological pushes you can make to actually get buy-in pretty quickly.
We're going to have to do a session on it. I just am about to let in the one, the only Jim Miller. Welcome to the Headcount Experts.
Hey, Jim.
Thank you.
Jim,
hello, how are you?
We're doing well. Chris and I were just chatting about 5 things that any new headcount planning process can do to ensure that it's at best practice, that people can have success in headcount planning beyond just going at it for the first time. And where we landed was, get your data right. Have good, clean data that you can pull from. Have an approval process so that you know how that changes and you take in an external partner for managing those changes. Track all of the changes in the variance and the reasons why so that you could use them in the future. Map that then demand, that fixed demand against your recruiting capacity. And then as you navigate as a recruiting leader, approach those conversations with an ROI mindset. So speak in the language of your executives. And Chris and I, we've been developing software to solve the headcount problem behind the scenes for a long time, but you're one of the foremost voices in the TA space today. So we're very interested to hear, one, do you agree? And then if so, what's your take? And my inkling, my thought is that some of the new features that have come out with Ashby as it relates to fraud detection and the process that you and I had talked about previous podcasts about running that timeline-based inbound gives you really clean data and allows you to do things that others can extract, whether they're using the Ashby system or not, to create a best practice for headcount planning. But welcome to the podcast. That's a quick catch up of where we are today. For those who don't know, Jim, introduce yourself. Let everyone know where you're calling from, and let's get into it.
So I'm Jim Miller. I lead the people and talent function at Ashby. We build an ATS amongst other people and talent technology products. As you can tell by my accent, I live in Northeast Georgia in the US on the East Coast. Originally, I'm from Suffolk in England, and I've been in the US it'll be 10 years in January.
Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm from New Jersey, which you could tell from the accent. And Chris, where are you from? Actually, you might have something in common.
So very similar. Grew up in the northwest of England, but I've been in Boston for a little over 10 years now. So nice. my accent is gradually fading away, maybe like yours, Jim. But it is nice to outnumber the Americans on the call today.
You guys are going to have to make those TikToks where it's like 1 week in Atlanta, 2 weeks in Atlanta. Anyway, all right, Jim. Headcount planning best practices. Talk to us about data cleanliness. Like, what do you look for when you're building your plan for 2026? So just a little precursor. You can share as much or as little as you want. We could also edit it out if you don't want to, if you don't want the specific details in. But as you're building Ashby's plan for 2026, you're a growth stage company. You have great funding. You have a lot of momentum. You have a specific take on what headcount planning looks like. The listeners of this podcast range from different stages and sizes of company. But what are you doing for 2026? When did you start that process? And how does it all come together for you at Ashby?
Sure. A little bit of background, I suppose, first. I joined in April 2023, employees 60. We're now 250 people. But what's really interesting is that revenue has grown far faster than headcount has grown during that time period, which is a big positive thing for a startup company, a growth company, and is a real contrast to the way companies were growing in 2021, early 2022, for example. And the reason I give that background is because what I don't do is anchor headcount plans on time, first and foremost. So we do headcount planning twice a year. We do it once in September and once in April. And the whole concept for us is to build a rolling plan for the future anchored to business outcomes, not to a time-based model. Now, our business outcomes, of course, have time within them so that we can measure how we're doing as a successful company, quarterly targets, yearly targets for revenue and so on. But we don't take that time basis and apply that to the headcount plan. We anchor the headcount plan directly to the business outcomes. So, for example, for product support, a role that we hire a lot of, we want fantastic customer experience from our product support team. Each one of the heads for product support is anchored to a total revenue goal for the company. And every time we hit a new version of that, just for argument's sake, it's 2 million in revenue. Every time we hit another 2 million, a new headcount opens. So we're future-proofed. If we grow very quickly revenue-wise, we don't run the risk of reputational damage because we've grown far faster than our headcount plan. I've seen companies hit double revenue targets that they plan for a quarter, but not make the hires behind the scenes. So in effect, you're behind in your hiring, and as I say, that can lead to reputational risk. The converse of that is what we saw in 2022 when you get a downturn. If the downturn happens and you start to get revenue churn, you haven't hired to a plan in a quarter or a year. Instead, you've stopped hiring because the next role hasn't been approved. Backfills start to not be approved because the threshold isn't there for those ones to be approved. So that's the basis of how we think about headcount planning. For September, we're looking 18 months out. So we'll have a nice 18-month plan that takes us through to the end of Q1 of 2027. And then in April, after Q4, the big quarter for SaaS companies, and Q1, we'll have very clear signal on how that panned out and where we are. And then we will reinstitute another 18 months rolling plan so that we're constantly future-proofed against extreme growth or downturns.
it sounds like you kind of layer in these kind of milestones, and then you add capacity as you kind of hit those milestones, and that actually refreshing that every 6 months is going to update that plan for you. I'm curious how that actually plays out tactically in kind of month to month. Do you ever kind of update or change those plans, or is that pretty much locked in for that 6 month period?
What we do is we lock in the revenue amounts. I use product support as example because that's a company-wide revenue amount. But let's take a startup customer success manager. Each of those headcounts are based on the average book size for startup CSMs. So it might be that we have a fantastic quarter for enterprise sales, and therefore we don't make as many hires as we originally thought we would have to for startup CSMs because the business hasn't been there. And for our strategic CSMs that look after our enterprise customers, that's based on an average book value. So we have three real buckets of headcount. We have the success-driven headcount. So that's what I've just described, where it's a revenue amount, an average book size amount, but anchoring really on revenue. Then we have an employee growth headcount. So there are some functions that we use the traditional ratio model. So the people team, for example, every X number of new employees, we will add a new HRBP to make sure that the functions are looked after. Finance is treated in that way as well. Then we have our investment headcount bucket. So that's completely separated from anything revenue related. Sales, account executives go into that bucket, as do software engineering, for example. At the moment, as a growth company, we will overinvest into those spaces in order to drive everything else. But what we don't do is make the mistakes that I saw in 2021, where the whole company is ratio based and everyone raced to spend their funding rounds on new sales forces and then said, well, if our sales team is this big, then marketing needs to be this big, customer success needs to be this big, and engineering are like, hey, we're always 23% of the business, so we need this number of new engineers. And all of a sudden you've grown this company, but the revenue hasn't come in from that sales force. And of course, with the interest rate changes, the macroeconomic conditions, that caused massive problems for folks, and they couldn't pay the bills for the staff that they built outside of the sales organization. It became a strategy of hope when you looked at it in hindsight. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So we don't adjust the plans because the plans have adjustment built into them organically based on their very nature. What happens is that the headcount ends up drip feeding into my teams on almost a daily basis. New headcount is released and improved. That means that, to your point, Eric, right at the very beginning, capacity planning is flipped on its head. Because for us, you don't have the massive bulk of headcount upload on the start of each quarter. Here's the Q2 headcount plan, go higher, faster. Instead, the recruiters are getting new roles on almost a daily basis. They are opening those roles. That workload that we see of recruiter resume review, recruiter screens, that activity is then smoothed across the course of the week, the month, the quarter, the year, and recruiter productivity goes through the roof. And only at that point do you then get to be able to look back at the data and go, now we've got clean data. We haven't put anything artificial in that blocks our data, giving clarity as to what true recruiter capacity is. Everyone else is working on a basis of 8 per, and this is the number of recruiters we need in order to do all of this hiring. My team are looking and going, we don't even break a sweat, and we do 20, 24, 25, 29 in a quarter because the workload is spread out. And then we do things like our cohort-based hiring with timed postings to use data to influence how much pipeline we build and so on.
So a couple of things. For those listening, tuning in for the first time, for Jim's excellent advice, we've covered the difference between a rolling forecast and top-down or bottom-up or bulk uploads in our approaches episode. And one of the main things that sticks out to me about the process that you run organically is the idea that we're going to cover towards the beginning of next year, which is the capacity demand forecasting and using the spacing of requisition timing to maximize a recruiting team's capacity, right? Front-loaded plans are the number one killer of revenue and OpEx forecast variance. If you could have that predictable recruiting demand in a timely way, and you have the brand equity that Ashby has to drive your applications so that you could run a timed process and really get predictable about it. Like that is the upper echelon of like planning execution. What I'm curious about is how do you factor in the time components of revenue? So like, let's say you're trending towards a revenue target for a CSM or a product support person, but you're not there yet, but it's going to take you that timed, you have a certain amount of time to make the posting, go through the resumes, make the offer, have that person quit, start their job again. So at what point are you unlocking that headcount, and how did you navigate the conversation with the business to say, here's what the revenue forecast looks like, and this is what I need? And one more follow-up question that Chris, I know, is going to ask is, if you do need a new recruiter, how do you factor in the time it takes to find the recruiter, the ramp of that recruiter, so that then you do have the capacity to meet the time of that future demand that's coming as a function of revenue? So long question, but I am curious.
One first, because we do offset planning for recruiting, so that we can already see what the plans are for the future year. So we build in the recruiting hiring in the summertime, to support the fact that the Q4 will create that extra growth in results running into Q1's higher targets and revenues that will stream in and higher hiring. So that's that piece. To go backwards in your question, I hope I can remember to cover all of the different elements. Aligning the business, first of all, as a leadership team, and then down through our the teams underneath us, we're focused on one thing, which is break even. Right, for a startup growth company, that's the point. So my teams are anchored on quality of hire. The better the people we hire, the earlier we can pull that break-even point, and we can see it coming. So this is a fantastic situation to be in. So understanding that all of the over-hiring that could happen in a plan is going to push that date back makes everyone very comfortable with this concept. You've got notice periods, you've got time to fill, you've got ramp periods. All of that math can be built into the model to work back in time. And in effect, what it pans out to look like is a just-in-time model where you are always one hire ahead. So there's actually one more piece to bring in here, which is evergreen roles. And the math there is pretty straightforward. If a position's time to fill is longer than the time it takes to get to the next revenue threshold to open the next headcount, then that role becomes evergreen. So that's the transition between those one-off positions and the evergreen positions, to make sure we're keeping up there. And then if we get ahead of ourselves, then of course we can slow the roll on those positions, and so on. But so that's that piece. So you've got each of these different factors coming into play. And then I've got my friends in RevOps and sales finance who do all the predicting models. So they're incredibly accurate, and they're able to tell me, this is roughly when we're going to hit each of these different revenue goals. So we can build that into the plan, and then we anchor on a revenue number that is indicative of that time period, and then the thing getting to the right stage. Just for argument's sake, right? You call it, if we hit 76 million at this point, then that suggests we're going to hit 80 million at this point. Ergo, that 76 is the trigger for the headcount you need in place for 80 million. And that's got the ramp and the time to fill and everything else built into it. Those were just off the cuff numbers. But I think you get to the point there. So then inside Ashby, I've got all of my custom fields to be able to put every single piece of information in there. And these fields are conditional. So for product support, the conditional field is ARR per. For scaled customer successful, the startups customer success managers, that's the average book size. That's a gross amount of revenue for startups. And then I already know what the end count behind that is. So each one then triggers the next revenue amount, and the averages are built into that factor. And a whole range of other custom fields that trigger and then also give us information like sourcing is required on this role. And we source in advance of the role's opening, not after the role is opened. So every time a hiring manager gets to a role that's been deemed sourcing required, there's a project already built for them. Here's the list of candidates who become the inspiration for the job description, who get the reach out the day the job opens and all of that kind. So it's incredibly data driven. And Everything has its interdependencies and it's all mapped out in the system.
Extremely
one-
complex. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, one of the things that really stands out is a lot of we're on episode 5 now. Pretty much everything we've talked about is kind of maps directly to what you just said. The kind of working backward from the business, the predictable demand, the using data, the kind of tying everything back and making decisions that are dynamic and agile. But I think we also know we've spoken about war stories of actually having to build these functions out ourselves, and it's you're at the end state, and I think a lot of the people that would listen to this are trying to get to that end state. I wonder if you could talk about what changed over the last 2 years. How did you actually get to this point where you have this business backwards approach, where you have this somewhat predictable demand, and you can staff your team, and your recruiters are, no sweat on 20 to 25 recs, when, from experience, I've seen recruiters struggle to hit 2 recs a month, and close. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. The first thing is actually the war stories from 21, 22. I saw what went wrong, put my head down and said, we've got to be able to reinvent how we do headcount planning after the first round of layoffs in September 2022. Random story. I became a US citizen on the day the Queen died and on the same day that we did our first round of layoffs. So that was a pretty big day. This is where I came up with this revenue per model. And then myself and FP&A, this is in my previous role at Full Story, and we worked backwards in time to the day that I started and then played the tape forward on the revenue model. Would we have needed to make the layoffs at that point had we had this model in place? And it turns out no. We'd have actually had over 100 open heads that would not have been hired because we'd have been able to see the signal because of the way that we'd changed headcount planning. So I had that in my pocket when I joined Ashby, and I found some like-minded philosophies, if not exactly this particular pathway. And the first one of those is that we only add sales folks here when everybody else in that particular team, function, region is reaching quota. So every new sales hire joins a successful sales team rather than the front loading that Eric mentioned earlier, where, right, this is our revenue goal and this is the backwards math and this is the territory map and this is the number of butts and seats we need, go, go, go. And you're like, we haven't even hired the enablement people or the first line managers for these reps. This is not well planned out. And that credit to HubSpot, because they're the real big influence for that style of sales growth and building. So then you end up with a much more sustainable growth model because of that concept. And everyone's already bought into that when I joined. And the second thing that happened was our head of finance joined. So a few months after me, but he'd been through the first FP&A hire. Hi, Shane. First FP&A hire at Fastly, and worked his way all the way through there to post IPO. So he'd seen all of this before. And we started to put our heads together. And there were a couple of interesting points where we had a particular revenue milestone 3 months earlier than we thought we were going to hit it at the beginning of that year. And I'm going back 2 years at this point. And that was a great example because we were able to say, here we go. This is the milestone we were planning on. Here's what the headcount plan would have looked like on the day we were due to hit that revenue goal. Here's what our headcount looks today, and we've just hit it 3 months earlier. Here's the delta. That delta is all customer facing, customer support, customer success, and so on. This is our reputational risk situation. This is why we need to change to this reactive model with this level of planning, and anchoring still on that principle of the break-even date is the point of success. Putting those two pieces together, that's how we were able to get to that stage. So for anyone starting out, it's really anchoring on what could go wrong. What are the things looking around the corners from our own experiences as a leadership group? And your head of TA, if they're not sitting in the seat, I'm lucky I'm the head of people and the head of TA, but they should be in the room for this because they will have experienced this in some way, shape or form. And seeing around the corners, predicting the future. Someone came to me, a tiny example, someone came to me and said, why do we do backfill approvals from finance before the head of department gets to say which role they will spend that backfill on? I'm like, because we don't know what's coming and we're going to get in the habit of doing things right. And backfills, attrition, is the lever we can use to right size the company in case of any downturn. So we're putting in these steps early to future proof us as a company, because my great belief is we should never, ever need to make a RIF.
I think the number one thing I see across all three of us who you're doing it today, Jim, and I love listening to the current process that you've built. Chris and I have come up to develop headcount solutions after doing it ourselves. All three of us, the thread between them outside of these 5 things that we're talking about is a good partner in finance. So companies are just going to do headcount planning in different ways, right? Having a rolling forecast, using revenue as a way to unlock headcount, and then scaling your ratios and investments from that kind of baseline that's a great end state to get to. A lot of the scaling companies or customers that have kind of different philosophies on executive ownership. I'm not here to tell them that they're right or that they're wrong, but a finance person's revenue forecast that unlocks headcount delivered to a manager at one time, the recruiting leader should still be able to navigate those same conversation points, right? So if revenue unlocks a new seller, a new CSM, or new product person, whether I give you 100 headcount for the whole year, 18 months today, or whether you unlock it over time with finance, I as a recruiting leader should be able to either know myself or take partner in a finance person to say, this is the impact of hiring early or late. So as you have your headcount plan and as you track the variance and start dates or salaries, you can then speak to the business about what is the impact of us doing these things in this way. And what I hear from you very clearly is, I'd like to expand on a little bit more as we get to the closing minutes of our time together, is how do you speak to the business about this process, right? When the executive team comes to Jim and says, how's it going? Right? What are you saying to the business, and how are you referencing the process or the data within headcount to articulate back to the business the performance of the recruiting team, the performance of the people team, and the performance of the contributors or other executives in the business?
I'm very lucky with the tooling that we have in that the dashboards are live, real time, and fully exposed. So my peer group who we sit on the sofas in the Airbnb twice a year to do this planning, somewhere in the US. We've lived and breathed this. We've walked through every single detail of minutia to understand what the plan is and the refresh plan and so on. So we all know the nuance. And then the dashboards are built not from my perspective, but from their perspective to represent the information to them so they can check in and see the company or filter down to their departments at any time and the progress that we're making against those positions. So that's the starting point. I'm a great believer that if you expose the data, there's that deep transparency. It takes all the emotion out. Then most of the time you don't need the meetings to discuss that. Instead, you're discussing what could potentially go wrong or go very, very right that causes us to need to change direction. What are we seeing from the business that perhaps we didn't anticipate? Do we need to build a new function that's never existed before because of X? For example, professional services was a function that we put into place in probably late 2023 as an example of that. That's really how I focus on the communication and the dissemination of that information, everybody being on the same page with the same data and full transparency.
I love it. Data cleanliness, tracking the variance, mapping your capacity against demand, and speaking in the language of the executive team seem to be the most common threads in creating a good headcount planning process. Chris, any closing thoughts? What do you want to know from Jim as we wrap up what is probably our best episode ever? I know I say it every time, but episode 5. What's your closing thoughts with Jim Miller?
Really, just any thoughts about 2026? Any surprises that you think anyone going through this process right now should be aware of?
I think we've got to mention the AI thing, and all I'm hearing is folks not seeing the ROI from AI being deployed without a plan. And there's so much organic deployment going on. Deliberate, intentional deployment of technology, be it AI or anything else, that's designed to save humans time. That time has to be isolated before the technology is deployed, because otherwise, to use Parkinson's law of productivity, work will fill the time available to them. So you end up with a zero ROI from deploying the technology if the people are then able to do work that historically wasn't a priority. And now they're just doing even more busy work. So you as the TA leader, you as the people leader, or you as an executive needs to make sure that the ROI of the deployment is a time value and that time is isolated and repurposed before the deployment of the technology. Now, on the topic of headcount planning, that might well mean smaller teams, either repurposing of workforce from that work that they were previously doing, or repurposing of open headcount that is now no longer required because technology is taking away that time. You do that first, not afterwards. Then there's a risk appetite situation that you need to deal with as a company. Do we actually deploy this technology, or are we better off keeping the humans in seats? And that's the proper conversation to have at that point. That's going to come to the front in 2026.
Key point there is without a plan. I think assuming that you have 20% less capacity requirements in 2026 because of AI is only valid if you actually have a plan for how you're going to regain that 20% capacity back. So I think that's a great point for closing out.
One more point in here. The one thing that people are forgetting is the cost of the lawyers. The AI, the cost savings that you get from the AI might well be eaten up by the cost of the compliance and legislation lawyers who need to do all of this work to make sure that you're not going to get into trouble as a company. That has to be in the equation. A customer of ours came to me the other day and went, they want to do this. And I was like, this is the lawyer price for that kind of work. And they were like, what? And the CEO went, you lot carry on, you're cheaper.
Well, I think a big, interesting unknown ahead of us with what AI is actually going to do for our productivity. I'd say in my world, I see the ratios of work per person changing slightly, but not necessarily impacting headcount as much as the crazy news articles would say. But TBD, a lot in the future to be learned. Tim, it's been a pleasure to have you a part of the episode, and I hope that we get to do many more of these in the future.